cause could not have created the universe, and how really believing in the supernatural is more reasonable than to believe in purely the natural. Okay, good, it's going to work. Now, there's a lot of textbooks nowadays, you're not going to hear a lot about what we talked about last week. Because in the spirit of Darwinism, we like to overlook evidence sometimes. There's an age called the Age of Enlightenment in 1680s, 1815. And what it was in England is when men kind of started falling away from God. It was an age of rational thinking, if you will. It questioned authority, embraced the notion humanity could be improved through rational change, no need for supernatural, and there's really no outside absolute truths. Then you go into the next era, which is called the Romanticism era. It glorified human emotion. It's all about how I feel, okay? So you think about how these pieces start to fall together. The last era was all about, well, we think we're smarter than God, so we don't need him. And now you think, well, we feel that we don't need a God, so we don't need him. And if you see this last point here, it says there's a very high appreciation of nature, which came into really saying that you didn't need a God. It had a very godless beginning. Romans talks a little bit about people such as this. It says, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Now that last part about worshiping the creation is really how evolution got started. We might have all heard the joke, oh, well, it's kind of like a religion. They say, well, no, it's science. And no, it's really a religion. This idea of naturalism, if any of you have heard of that, it's basically a combination that means natural religion. That there's no supernatural and everything is purely knowable by scientific observation. So if you see, again, how the pieces fit together, man starts believing, well, we don't really need a God. We're smarter than that. Our rational thinking, we can figure it all out. So you start scrambling. Okay, you naturalists here, y'all are pretty smart. You got the science. How are we going to replace God? And then up came a spitfire young naturalist by the name of Charles Darwin. This is him before he got the beard that we all know him by. 1859, I won't read that whole title, but he published his hallmark book on the origin of species, which was basically his granddaddy's idea that a long time ago his granddad had the idea that species could somehow evolve into everything that we currently see. And that this had happened over a long period of time, and really, it wasn't his idea. He's somewhat of a thief. Alfred Russel Wallace and Sir Charles Lyell came up with a lot of the ideas that he gets credit for. Now, there's a few basic concepts of evolution. There's 5, really. And the first one is perpetual change, and that the world has a very long history of gradual change. Common descent, that all life descended from a common ancestor. The multiplication of species, that old species are split and transformed into new ones. This is macroevolution, as we know it. Gradualism says that small incremental changes occur over long time periods, and that natural selection, which is known as survival of the fittest. He made these based on a few observations, that organisms have great potential fertility. In a population, animals or creatures have a great propensity to reproduce. It says that natural populations normally remain constant in size except for minor fluctuations. Man, is that ever going to come back to bite him? Next one. Come on now. There we go. Natural resources are limited. Again, this is natural selection. It talks about how when there's a limited amount of resources, the weaker ones get out-competed. For example, long-necked giraffes, short-necked giraffes. If all the trees are super-duper tall, all the short-necked giraffes don't get to eat and they die off, and you get tall giraffes. Survival of the fittest. All populations show organismal variation, and then finally the variation is heritable. These traits can be passed down over a long period of time and eventually create new species. But really what we're going to see over this week and the next is that there's a lot of assumptions there. Lots of assumptions. You assume that a mutation can exist that creates a new species, but really we've never seen it. You get all kinds of fancy pictures in the textbook. This came out of the book I have right here. Took it last semester. It has all these finches and how they evolved. How about this one? It says that the embryos of certain species all look the same at certain phases, so obviously we must have evolved from the same ancestor. But again, you're making an assumption. That doesn't prove common ancestry. It could prove a common designer. You're making an assumption based on the evidence. And you got these big sweeping charts with ages that I can't even pronounce. Eocene, Oligocene, can't even read some of them, saying about how over 4.5 million years we've all gotten here. Now, to the mind of a young Christian, again, we talked last week about how so many are falling away from the faith when they start reading stuff like this. With your fancy words and your big phrases and your charts and graphs such as this, you can start to think, man, maybe this stuff's real. Maybe they know what they're talking about. How about these, showing how little lizards turned into chipmunks and then elephants? Interesting enough. How about this one? If you see the little purple bones here, they assume that because they're all somewhat similar, obviously, we had a common evolutionary ancestor. They automatically rule out they could have been designed similarly. Again, an assumption, not clear-cut evidence. So there's a more basic concept of evolution, and we're going to dissect these 5 one by one. It says a natural process is capable of forming everything. Now, last week, we ruled this one out right off the bat. Natural process creates virtually nothing. The next one says that we have evolved gradually over millions of years, and it argues with our biblical concept that we know the earth is very young, that man has descended. We can follow the chronology and say that it's about 6,000 years old, give or take. Common traits are evidence of common ancestry, like we said before. If it's similar, it must have evolved. And that small changes in a species can evolve into new species, macroevolution. Now we're going to get into those last two. If I can work this thing. We're going to get into those next week. But for the most part, we're going to get into the second one here, that we've evolved gradually. Come on now, there we go. There's a theory called irreducible complexity. And it's really not much of a theory, it's a concept. We see it a lot in science. Now remember, Darwin's first point was perpetual change. That everything, given enough time, could evolve here. And then he said this. He said, if it could be demonstrated, this is in The Origin of Species. He said, if it could be demonstrated any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight changes, my theory would absolutely break down. So again, like we saw with that amoeba we looked at, they didn't know then what we know now. He says, if it could be shown there's some way where it could not have gradually come to be, then everything I've said is futile. And this is the theory of irreducible complexity, that certain systems cannot evolve over time by small adaptations. A great example of this is DNA. We talked a little bit about DNA last week. Now, for those, if you can kind of scroll back in your mind to the biology notes that you didn't read in high school, you can go back to how proteins are made. Now, DNA, that chain is split. And as we see here, this chain right down here, that's RNA. Now, RNA binds with the DNA, and that is what creates your proteins. Well, what's interesting, if you remember, that there's 4 base nucleotides, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and adenine, that make up DNA, as well as a sugar phosphate backbone. All of this is created by proteins. Now, if you can catch what I'm throwing here, it'll work. Which one evolved first? See, because the DNA creates the RNA, and the RNA creates the proteins, and the proteins create the DNA. You take any one out, the entire system falls apart. Well, if you just had the DNA, well, we don't know what made it because we don't have proteins. You say, well, we have the RNA, but without the DNA, that doesn't work. Well, we have the proteins, but no RNA to make it. This continuum, or trinity, if you will, in a sense, could not have evolved over time. We keep going with the cell. Now, does anyone remember, I'm not going to ask you, the odds of this thing forming, as we looked at last week? If the Big Bang were true, okay, let's just assume it was true, and we had the raw materials, the odds of this forming naturally was 1 in 10 to the power of 340 million, okay? Not happening. Any one of these parts that you see here, a lot of these I can't even pronounce. Any of these were taken out, this would not work. If the nucleus wasn't there, it couldn't tell the membrane what proteins to let in and let out. It couldn't regulate the amount of fluid going in and going out. It would either dry up or it would overexpand and burst. If you didn't have motor cells here, the flagellar motor that we talked about, then you couldn't move around. You couldn't match with other cells. You couldn't find RNA. If any one of these parts was not there at its beginning, the entire cell would die. This could not have evolved over time. Go back to the flagellar motor. We talked about this last week. This is really the poster child of intelligent design. A fun fact I forgot to mention to y'all last week tail there, the little rotor that spins around. This dude right now inside of you, and there's billions of them, this dude is spinning around at 100,000 revolutions per minute. And within a quarter turn, it can stop and perform the same speed the opposite direction. Yes. Now you think about, okay, well, if God designed that, is it just to flex his muscles or to show off or whatever? Well, you see, these things are floating around in a cellular fluid inside you. It's not water. It's kind of like a syrup that's full of proteins and enzymes and food. Scientists estimate that the resistance that this thing is swimming through would be about the same as you swimming through peanut butter. That dude needs every one of those 100,000 revolutions per minute. What happened when the tail was slowly evolving? If it wasn't long enough, it couldn't produce enough push, and it wouldn't be able to carry out its functions. If the torque generating surface wasn't there, it couldn't create the power. If these small filaments here had not evolved at the right time, as it rotated 100,000 revolutions per minute, there'd be nothing to anchor it to the cell wall, and it would dislodge and the cell would die. So which one evolved first? It can't happen. That is irreducible complexity. Another theory of this, if y'all can see that all right, this is in the back page of this book right here. And you know, again, I'm no biologist, but I think I can do some reasoning and see some problems. Now, the general theory of evolution, to give you a kind of a little, backup, was that once the Earth came into being, it was like a star. It was lots of gases, and it started to rain, and it cooled it down, turned into rocks, and the rocks turned to soup, and the soup came alive. Basically, that's what you came from, rocks to soup to organisms. Well, then you have a problem. If the first form of life came from the rocks, how come the life is before the rocks? If the rocks created the life, how did the life come first? This is my favorite one. This one, at a glance, it could get you. Now, photosynthesis, we all know what photosynthesis is. It'll work here. There we go. Photosynthesis is how plants make food. They take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into oxygen. Now, apparently 2.5 billion years ago, these organisms right here, which aren't plants, mind you, I don't know how they do photosynthesis, they started, photosynthesizing, and I guess they were starting to lose hope. But, beacon in the dark, only 1 million years later, it started to make some oxygen. Now, again, I'm no biochemist, but this is the formula for photosynthesis, right? You got CO2, you got H2O, and you make glucose and oxygen. Carbon dioxide converts to oxygen. Now, do y'all see that right there? That's oxygen. Wait a minute. Oxygen was supposedly appeared 1 million years later. But photosynthesis can't happen without the oxygen. So again, which one showed up first? It's a legitimate problem. Another assumption you see here, if you see this is our friend from last week, the animal cell with the flagellar motor. So if you notice that 1 in 10 to the 340 millionth power, they've already filled in that gap for you. They've already assumed, well, we'll just go from here. Whereas we know last week that is impossible. Lots of assumptions, very little evidence. Now what you're looking at here is the thing we call the geologic column. And why I get into this is because, again, Darwin's theory of perpetual change was contingent on a very, very, very old Earth. It happened over millions and millions and millions of years. So they say, well, you see it all over the internet, you see it in the textbooks. How do we know that it's millions of years old? Now, there's two methods. We look at this, the geologic column, which is the order that things are buried in the crust of the Earth, and then we have radiometric or carbon dating, which I'm sure we've all heard the flaws of, and we'll discuss that. The assumption is that each rock layer of the Earth represented, millions of years. Well, the one that's the deepest down, that's the oldest, so whatever we find in there, those were our great-great-grandpappies. And then halfway up, we start to get these, and then now we're all the way up to where we are. And each rock layer is separated by millions of years, which again is an assumption. Could these layers of dirt and rock been laid down suddenly by a worldwide flood? It's a possibility, but they don't want you to consider the possibility. They're going to force feed it to you and say, well, this is what we think. This is known as the fossil record. Now we're going to go into carbon-14, and we've all heard about carbon dating. We say, well, it doesn't work. Well, here's why it doesn't work. Carbon-14 is basically radioactive carbon. And these radioactive carbon molecules, they don't like each other very much. They're all super mad at each other for some reason. So they're always trying to get away from each other. So all throughout something's life, you are gathering this carbon-14 from the atmosphere. When you die, it slowly starts to release. So, in theory, by seeing how much carbon-14 has left a fossil or an organism, you can tell about how old it is. Now, there's already some problems. If you notice, a half-life, or how long it takes half of it to leave, only takes about 5,000 years. And really, once you get down below 10%, these numbers get very blurry. So it's not very accurate to date anything older than 10,000 years. And then the book says, well, see, we already knew that, see. Well, now we're using potassium argon dating, because potassium argon has a half-life of 1.3 million years. We can use that one. So let's just see how it's working. Everybody see this dude here? Looks like a roly-poly? Well, it's not. It's called a trilobite. This is supposedly your great-great-great-great-granddaddy right here. This turned into some of the first lizards and fish in the Cambrian period, 541 million years ago. Now again, based on the theory of evolution, every rock layer is a different era. So we should have never existed on the same plane as these. Well, there was one found in Antelope Springs, Utah in 1968. There's the trilobite right there. And there it is in a human footprint. Wearing shoes, mind you. Now, either the monkeys had it figured out way before we did, or that thing ain't that old. And they say, well, you know, maybe you're right. Maybe they came about in a different period, but they could have lived long enough to see humans until you find out they went extinct 240 million years ago. So again, we look at the geologic column. Trilobites, okay, we're up here. We're at the top. Trilobites started down here and went extinct here. By the theory of aging the Earth based on rock layers, we should have never been on the same plane as these dudes. We'll go to the next one. This is called the Zapata footprint. It's found by a hunter in New Mexico. He's running through the mountains, found this, and he had a buddy who was an archaeologist. He said, hey, I want you to come check us out. It's pretty cool. They analyzed this human footprint, and it was supposedly embedded in rock from the Permian period, 300 million years ago. Now, the first supposed human ancestor came on 5 million years ago, and humans have only been here, supposedly, for 200,000 years. So it begs the question, if we're up here, how did our footprint get down there? It's a problem. This whole carbon dating geologic column, is it working? No. This one can be found right down the road in Glen Rose, Texas, at the Creation Museum. A human footprint over a dinosaur footprint. Now, you talk in all these science books, it's all in this book, that we never coexisted with dinosaurs, supposedly. Again, because it violates the theory. If you zoom in a little bit, here's us, and there's your dinosaurs. We should have never coexisted. But apparently, we were walking all over each other in Glen Rose, Texas. So, you tell me. This right here was found in Dowson County, Montana, not very long ago, about 6 years ago. It is the tusk, or the horn, from a Triceratops. We've all seen Triceratops, got the big shield, 3 big old horns, pretty cool looking things. So they carbon dated it and found out it was only about 33,500 years old. And they say, ha, see, we got you goofy creationists. It's more than 6,000 years old. Well, see, that's a problem because supposedly they lived 60 million years ago and went extinct 2 years later. By the rock layers, this doesn't work. Living tissue. This is an interesting one. This was found fairly recently. If you can see right here, what we're looking at is some blood platelets, some blood matrix, and just some basically blood, what you're looking at. They dug this out of a bone and analyzed it in a lab and moistened it up. It looks pretty living. It looks about like what you pull out of a modern human bone. Until it's pulled out of a 68 million year old T-Rex. Living tissue in a 68 million year old dinosaur. Now, under the best conditions, scientists estimate in an oxygen-free environment that living tissue deteriorates after 1 million years. So the basic theory would say, oh, well, this T-Rex, I guess he got tired of kicking around in the dirt, and he fell over, was exposed to the elements, and then slowly got buried, but 68 million years later, his inside tissue looks like this. Could it be that he was only a few thousand years old and was buried rapidly by sediment in a flood? I'm not asking them to agree, I'm just asking if it's possible. Again, the scientific method is to examine the evidence for what it says. Now this right here, there were some people hiking, I believe I have it here, they were hiking in New Mexico. No, wrong actually. They were hiking in Texas, London, Texas. Yeah, there's a London, Texas. I know that now. 1934. Now they found this rock with a piece of wood sticking out of it, and they're like, oh, that's pretty cool, so they took it home. And then the husband took his hammer to it and found another hammer inside it. They took it to the lab and said, well, let's date it for you, see how long it's been there. Supposedly the rock was from the Ordovician era, 485 million years ago. And apparently the hammer was 500 million years old. And then they said, now, they investigated this, all the iron and stuff in here. They said it was 97% pure iron. They said the purity of this metal rivals things that we're manufacturing today. So they said, well, maybe humans have been around a lot longer than we thought. Or maybe the Earth's a whole lot younger than you thought. Again, I'm not asking you to believe. I'm just wanting you to acknowledge it's a possibility. And this is my favorite. This is the best one you're going to see. And this is one of the last examples we'll look at. Everyone knows what a geode is. Real pretty rocks. Looks kind of boring from the outside. Real sparkly on the inside. Well, there was a very unique one found in Olancha, California by a group of rock collectors. They went out on their little spelunking expedition. And they took it back to their lab and realized they tried to cut it down the middle to look at what you're seeing here, and it broke their diamond-bladed saw. They said, man, there's something really weird in here. They peeled it open, and there was some kind of strange object in the middle of it. They took it down, had it x-rayed and everything, and said, well, there's something metal in there. There's something metal, it's got some copper in it, and whatnot. This is another x-ray of it, found not that long ago. Now they said, well, before we give you results, we want you to know that it was radiometric dated, carbon dated, 500,000 years old. It was a spark plug. Now, either the creator of the gasoline motor is the greatest thief in all of human history, or that thing ain't 500,000 years old. Again, I'm not trying to impress anything on anyone. I just want you to look at the data and examine it for yourself. So if so much of this millions and billions of years that we read about is based on such flawed methods, why are we still using it? Here's an interesting quote that they will not want you to see. But at the 12th Nobel Symposium, a man by the name of T. Savi Soderberg and his buddy Mr. Olson said this: C14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict it, we put in a footnote, and if it's completely out of date, we just drop it. Now, again, I'm no scientist, but I think you're supposed to make your theories conform to the evidence rather than fabricate the evidence to make it fit your theory. And it's very startling that such flawed reasoning and flawed methods are so prevalent in those that are pouring it into the minds of very unstable youth, as in a very fluid state where they're trying desperately to find something to hold on to. So that's the end of the slides. That's all I had for this week. Next week we're going to look at really when it gets interesting, looking at the entire fossil record and looking at how branching of species by mutations in DNA is unbelievably impossible. And it just gets really, really interesting to see not only how DNA works, but how the fossil record that they boast about in here, talking about fossil documentation, is actually their biggest enemy. And it screams instantaneous creation by a supernatural being. So anyway, appreciate y'all. Thank you.